In this, the first of a two-part video series, I will be going over how I made this basic trestle style table with breadboard ends. The first part will cover the tabletop build. As with most of my builds, this one started with a SketchUp design to lay out the initial design of the table. The table I am building will be one of two that I am making for my family's entertainment space. The table is a basic trestle table with drawboard breadboard ends and a simple base. I wanted simple and linear in design, nothing fancy with this build. I am building the table out of ash, and some of the supply I got was wider than my 8-inch joiner could manage, so I started by ripping down the wider boards to just under 8 inches in width using my track saw. After that, the boards were all ran through the joiner to get one of the surfaces clean. Next, the boards were fed through the planer with the clean surface down and brought to the desired thickness. With this build, instead of using the joiner to get my reference edge, I elected to try and use the track saw to get my 90-degree reference edge on the boards. I laid out the track to where I would be taking off a small amount of wood to get my straight edge. After my first cut, I tested to make sure I was getting the 90-degree cut that I wanted, and since it was looking good, I proceeded to use the track saw to cut the rest of the boards. I then measured each board to determine the max overall width I could get when running the board through the table saw to get my second edge. I then set the table saw to that measurement for that individual board and cut the width. Measure, set fence, cut board, repeat. Once the boards were surfaced and cut to width, I reviewed them to determine what grain orientation I might want, checked a couple that had some checks in them that I would be trimming off later, and determined my final layout. I then tested the joints when the clamping pressure was applied. Once satisfied with the layout and the seams, I numbered the boards to retain the layout during the build. Here, I am applying glue, rolling it out with a rubber roller, and clamping the wood. I am using my set of Rockler panel clamps to do the glue up. As they have a max width of 36 inches and this table will need to be 40 inches for the final width, I needed to do the glue up in two separate sets. In place of the panel clamps, you could use parallel clamps or pipe clamps as desired. Once dried, I removed the clamps and moved the board to the side so I could clamp up the second panel. Of course, one has to remove the dried glue squeeze out. I cleaned up what I could from the top before it dried, but the panel clamps make it difficult to access the bottom squeeze out. After the board sections were glued up using the panel clamps, I needed to join them together. I will be using dominoes to assist with the lining up of the two sections. Here, I am marking where I will be placing the dominoes. You can also use biscuits, dowels, or clamping cauls to assist in place of the dominoes. Here I am cutting holes with the domino joiner for the dominoes. Good practice for the hip thrust cutting technique. Next is the glue up of the two tabletop halves. I start by applying glue to half of the domino length and inserting that into that half of the tabletop. Next, apply glue to that half of the table and the protruding domino length. Grab the other section of the tabletop, align the dominoes, and coax the two halves together, with a hammer if needed. I then tighten up the parallel clamps. add a couple small clamps to fix a slight adjustment issue of 2 of the boards, and add additional parallel clamps. Once dry, remove all the clamps. Scrape up the dry glue and double check overall width measurements. I used the track saw to start trimming the final dimensions. Start with one side, then use a T-track with a 90-degree angle stop for one end. Verify squareness. I got the thumbs up and proceeded with cutting the other 2 sides. And I did a little quick glue cleanup with the sander. Next was working on the drawboard breadboard ends utilizing dominoes for the joinery. I started by marking where I wanted to place the dominoes. Once placement was determined, I drew my reference lines for the domino joiner. When cutting the domino holes on the table, we want to use the tight settings on the domino. The breadboard side will have different settings. I will address those in a second. Using some quick clamps to hold the breadboard end in place, I transfer my reference lines to the breadboard end. When doing so, one of those lines I'm going to mark with a T. This is to denote the one domino hole in the breadboard end that is going to be cut using the tight setting. The other holes will be cut with the loose setting. I mark these with an L. If I have an odd number of dominoes, the tight hole will be the center domino hole. In this case, I had an even number, so I chose one of the 2 center holes. The loose holes are to allow for wood movement in the table. On the breadboard end, with the domino joiner still in the tight setting, I will cut the hole for the designated tight domino. Then change the domino joiner to the loose setting and cut the remaining domino holes on the breadboard. The next step is to glue up and insert the dominoes into the table side holes. I am only applying glue to the holes in half of the domino length. We do not want glue on the breadboard side of the dominoes at this time. Once the glue is dried, we need to clean up any glue squeeze out. Any glue may prevent the breadboard from having a tight fit against the table. I used a chisel to do so. Pardon my chisel work, it's still a skill I'm attempting to refine. Once the glue is cleaned up, I do a dry fit to make sure the breadboard end fits flush against the table. Note how the breadboard was left longer than the width of the table. This allows for easier removal of the piece when doing dry fits and will be cut to size later. Now it is time to mark the breadboard end for the dowel hole placement. In this case, I chose about half the distance of the protruding length of the domino from the table. I then marked my reference lines for this distance. As I was about to add the breadboard ends, I recalled before I do so, I should add my edge profile to the table. I decided to go with a slight 45-degree chamfer on the edges. This edge profile will be added to the breadboard ends as well later on. Back to the breadboard ends. I will use the drill press to drill the holes needed for the dowels that will be used to connect the breadboard ends. Drill each hole all the way through the board. We then want to place the breadboard end back on the table. Utilizing the drill bit that was just used to drill the holes, we're going to use that bit and the hammer to transfer a mark to the dominoes in the table. And once again, we remove the breadboard end. On the dominoes, you should now see your reference mark. On each domino, we want to mark a line about 1/32 of an inch from that mark towards the table side. This will be our reference mark for drilling our holes. Drill out the holes. With the exception of the marked tight domino, we want them to be loose. So I use the drill bit and wiggle the drill side to side to bore out more of a hole. This is to allow for wood movement in the table. The marked tight domino should be drilled normally. Now it is time to attach the breadboard ends. To allow for the dowels to get a better start, you want to trim the end a bit. I use a shop pencil sharpener for this task. We want to start by applying glue only to the domino marked as tight. I also apply a little glue just an inch or so on the table to either side of this domino. This will be the only part of the breadboard that is glued to the table. This is also to account for wood movement. Once this is done, put the breadboard end on the table. We will also apply glue to all of the dowel that goes into this tight marked domino. This is the only dowel this is done to. Hammer that into the breadboard. I usually go by touch on the underside to make sure the dowel comes through just past the trim part of the dowel. Then I use a flush trim saw to trim off the excess dowel. For the rest of the dowels in the loose dominoes, I hammer the dowel through until I can feel it start to protrude from the underside. Then I add a small amount of glue to the dowel on the top and hammer down a small amount. The idea is to only have it glued to the top part of the breadboard, not where it come in contact with the domino. Then I flush trim the dowels as well. Once the breadboards are attached and the dowels inserted, it is time to trim up the breadboard ends. I use the track saw to do this. I like to leave the breadboard ends where they're a little proud of the table edge, about 1/8 of an inch. Also note to check the depth of your track saw cut. After the breadboard ends are trimmed to size, I go back to add the edge profile with the router to match the table. Next is everyone's favorite part, sanding. I progressed through the grits from 80 to 120 to 150. I stopped at 150 as I'll be applying Rubio Monocoat. With the last grit, I will also water pop the grain and then do another light sanding. And this last bit is optional, but I like the look of it. I take the track saw and with a narrow depth of about 1/16 of an inch or so, I cut a groove along the seam between the table and the breadboard end. If you don't like it, skip it. And with that, the tabletop construction is done, and that concludes this first part of the video series. The next part will cover the building of the base, finishing, and final assembly. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you'd like to be notified when the next part is released. Thanks for watching.